The rain began before they finished tying the last knot. It fell in thin lines over the ridge, tapping the tarp with a rhythm too steady to ignore. Each drop seemed to stitch the forest closed around them, sewing tree to tree, earth to sky, night to night. Michael tightened the guy lines until the tarp sloped just right, water slipping down its edge like strings of glass. James built the fire low between damp stones, coaxing the flame into life with dry cedar shavings he had kept wrapped in wax paper. Laura spread the sleeping bags in the tent, smoothing each one with quiet, deliberate care. Heather gathered branches just dry enough to feed the fire without choking it. It was their first night in Pine Hollow, a forgotten stretch of forest with no signs, no maps, no other campers. They had chosen it for its quiet, for the way the trail narrowed into nothing, for the way it felt left alone. The fire breathed its first blue, then amber, then orange. Steam rose from wet bark, the smell of smoke and resin mixed with rain. They sat close, knees bent, cups of tea warming their hands. Conversation slowed the way it always does when the forest begins to speak louder than people. That was when Laura noticed the glow. It was not firelight, not flashlight, a dim amber lantern, half hidden behind the first line of pines. It moved slowly, parallel to camp, not toward them, not away, just walking its quiet line between the trees, as though pacing a long porch. "Do you see it?" she whispered. Michael followed her gaze. His shoulders tightened, then eased. "Lantern," he said simply, not naming whose, not naming why. James stirred the pot of rice again, though it no longer needed stirring. Heather pulled her jacket tighter. All four of them watched in silence. The lantern drifted on. It swayed, but not the way a flashlight beam sways. When carried by a tired hand, it moved like resin inside glass, heavy, deliberate, old. The rain hushed itself around them, making room for the sight. The fire bent low, its voice quiet. The glow paused, held steady for 3 breaths, then continued its silent path along the tree line. "It's just another hiker," Heather murmured. "Who hikes here at night?" Laura asked, in the rain. The lantern did not answer. It moved with the patience of something that had walked the same line for years. They did not follow. They kept to the fire, to the tarp, to the simple circle of warmth. But Michael's eyes lingered. Each time the glow faded, he waited to see if it would return. It always did, like a sentence repeated so softly you begin to think you imagined it. Later, when the fire had burned to coals, when the tea was gone and the pot was rinsed, Michael stepped to the edge of the tarp with the kettle in his hand. The rain fell harder there, drumming on his hood. He tilted the kettle into the stream and looked up. The lantern was closer now, still at the tree line, still patient, but closer. Laura joined him, a headlamp in her hand. She turned it to its lowest setting and placed it on a stump by the fire, a small, soft circle of light. "Keep the light where you rest," she said, surprising herself with the words, as though they had been waiting in her mouth. The lantern paused. Its glow fluttered once, then steadied. It seemed to acknowledge the gesture. Then it drifted back, deeper into the trees, until the rain swallowed it whole. They went into the tent. Zippers made their small teeth music. Sleeping bags opened like petals. The rain wrote steady lines on the fabric overhead. Sleep came slowly. Michael listened to every seam, tracing the drops with his mind. Laura turned once, her breath warming the inside of the tent. Heather's hands shifted in the dark. James breathed shallowly, then deeper, as though walking into a dream. Somewhere past midnight, the glow returned. Not outside this time, but through the fabric itself, just a pressure of brightness, soft as a candle seen through a curtain. It paused by the headlamp's low circle, the way a parent pauses at a doorway. It did not push in, it did not demand. It lingered long enough to be felt, then moved away with the rain. They dreamed slow dreams, of resin in glass, of moss on stone, of paths that curved but never ended. Each dream carried the same feeling. If light comes to you, keep it where you rest. Do not chase it into the rain. When they woke, the forest looked washed, renewed. The headlamp still glowed faintly on the stump. Beyond the tree line, the ferns leaned aside in a faint track, as if something had walked there many times. They did not follow it. They packed their camp with quiet hands, scattering ashes, folding tarps, smoothing moss. As they left, Michael looked once more to the pines. The lantern did not appear, but he felt it watching, not unkind, not unwelcoming only, making sure they had learned the rule. The clearing was a hollowed bowl among tall pines, softened by moss and the steady patience of rain. It had not been chosen so much as discovered, the way a chair seems to discover you when you sit without thinking. The ground was firm enough to hold pegs, soft enough to cradle a night's rest. The air smelled of cedar and wet earth, a quiet perfume that made conversation slower and kinder. By dusk, the tent was standing, a modest shape beneath the dripping branches. Its nylon walls glistened like dark leaves, stitched in silver threads where the rain slid down seams. Inside, the floor was dry and smooth, a small square of claimed space in an endless forest. Outside, the fire muttered low under a sheet of canvas stretched between poles. Sparks rose only a hand's breadth before the rain coaxed them back into steam. They ate with the ease of people who had walked far and needed no more than food that was warm and steady. The meal had no ceremony: rice, beans, a little cheese. Still, the steam curled upward like an offering, and the forest accepted it without comment. By the time they zipped the tent for the night, the rain had found its long rhythm, not the hurried patter of afternoon showers, not the harsh percussion of a storm, but the kind of patient counting that feels like a lullaby. Each drop found its surface by needle. Tarp, earth and added its note to the slow choir. They lay in their sleeping bags and listened. First came the ordinary sounds: rain on fabric, wind in branches, the soft creak of guy lines under strain. Then, slowly, something else layered itself beneath. It was not louder than the rain, not even as loud as their own breath, but it had the unmistakable cadence of respiration. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. A second tent breathing alongside their own. James noticed first. He kept still, eyes half closed, letting the sound draw itself into focus. At first he thought it was the fabric of their own shelter shifting with wind. But no, the sound was slower, deeper, almost deliberate. It paused just long enough between breaths to remind him of a sleeper turning over. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Laura stirred beside him. She listened. Her brow softened, not with fear, but with recognition, as if she had been expecting it. "Another tent," she said quietly, not as a question, but as a simple naming. They lay in silence then, all four of them, hearing their own breaths and the second, slower breath. The rain carried the two rhythms together until they were impossible to separate. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. The sound was not near or far, not outside or inside. It was simply there, like a companion who did not need to be seen. The night stretched. Sometimes the second breath matched theirs, as though keeping watch. Sometimes it fell out of rhythm. making them aware of their own lungs. Heather turned in her bag and felt the fabric respond, not with the usual whisper of nylon, but with something closer to a sigh. She pressed her palm flat against the floor and felt the faintest echo beneath her expansion. A release, as though the ground itself had lungs. She said nothing. Words felt too sharp for what was happening. Instead, she let her breath slow until it matched the hidden cadence. The tent seemed to approve. Its fabric shifted gently, as if relieved to be understood. Dream came early to them that night, but it was not dream as in pictures or stories. It was dream as in rhythm, the simple trust of breathing in unison with something larger. Each of them slept in shallow waves, waking briefly to sip air, to shift a shoulder, to listen again to the tent that breathed. At one point near midnight, James unzipped the door a hand's width and looked out. The forest was quiet, its dark shapes blurred by rain. No second tent stood beside theirs. No figure moved through the dripping branches. Only the faint impression of flattened grass, so neat it might have been pressed by hands that knew how to make a bed in moss. When the rain brushed the clearing, the grass lifted again, as though it had never been touched. James closed the zipper gently, careful not to disturb the invisible rhythm. Inside, the breathing presence waited for him, resuming its steady rise and fall. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to join it, his chest expanding with the nylon walls, contracting with the silence between drops. The hours between midnight and dawn had a peculiar elasticity. Time stretched, thinned, returned upon itself. The rain carried it forward. The tent slowed it down. At intervals, each camper dreamed of a different form of breath. Laura dreamed she was the tent itself, her skin taut, her ribs bending with wind. Heather dreamed she was the rain, her body falling in long, weightless arcs and dissolving on canvas. Michael dreamed he was soil, inhaling water, exhaling roots. James dreamed he was stone, unmoving yet filled with a slow tide of air that had no beginning or end. They woke briefly from these dreams, not startled, only shifted. Each time they opened their eyes, the tent was still breathing. A slow pulse in the walls, a gentle draw in the seams. It felt less like a haunting and more like companionship, as though another presence had chosen to keep them safe through the night. Toward dawn, the rain thinned. The breathing slowed with it, deeper now, longer between inhales, like someone entering final sleep. The campers stirred one by one. No one spoke. They lay in silence, honoring the presence that had kept them through the dark. At last the rain stopped altogether. The clearing grew bright with mist. The tent exhaled one final time, a long sigh that pressed cool air across their faces, and then the rhythm ended. The fabric stilled. The silence that followed was complete, but not empty. It was the kind of silence that lingers after a song ends, when the ear continues to hear what the air has already forgotten. They rose quietly, stepping out into the damp clearing. The flattened square of grass where the second tent might have stood was gone. The ground lifted back into place, blades of moss unbent, as though no one had ever pressed them down. Heather looked back once as they packed. The tent glistened with pearls of rain, perfectly still now, a simple structure again. And yet she felt certain that tonight, or another night, when the rain returned and the forest leaned close, the tent would breathe once more. The creek had been their guide all day. It did not rush, did not tumble, did not demand their attention. It slipped between stones with the steady patience of something older than trails. Where the forest thickened, they kept it to their left. When fog blurred the ridge, they followed its voice. The water gave them direction when the compass needle wavered. It was constant, familiar, kind. By afternoon, the rain returned, soft at first, then certain. Drops gathered in their hoods and slid down their sleeves. The creek answered by rising a little, shouldering itself wider, its syllables deepening into a hushed murmur. The sound was calming, like a long conversation in the next room. But toward evening, James frowned. He pointed at a bent alder leaning over the bank, its trunk scarred with a pale strip where bark had been torn away. "We've passed this before," he said. Michael shook his head. "There are lots of alders." Yet 10 minutes later, they saw it again. Same curve, same scar, same lean into the water. They walked on. The creek bent left, then right, then left again. At each bend, something familiar waited. A flat rock with a quartz vein, a cluster of ferns leaning just so. A run of pebbles that hummed beneath the water like a stringed instrument. "We've been here," James said again, softer this time. Laura bit her lip. "The forest rhymes," she said. "That's all, it repeats itself." But the repetition was not random. It was exact. Each landmark arrived at the same interval, as if time itself had bent into a loop and was placing them back where they had been, again and again. The rain thickened, blurring the lines of the world. Their boots sank deeper into mud that felt both known and strange. When they stopped to rest, the creek seemed to pause as well, its voice holding steady on a single note, as though it too had lost its way. They chose a place above the bank to make camp. The ground was mossy but firm. A ring of roots cupped their fire like fingers. The creek whispered nearby, just out of sight, but close enough to be felt. They cooked in silence. Steam lifted from the pot and mingled with mist. The fire gave small comfort, its flame wavering with each breath of rain. The forest leaned close, waiting. That night, the creek moved closer. Inside the tent, they heard it not as a distant murmur, but as a whisper beneath the floor. It was as if water had risen into the soil, seeping under their bags, speaking through seams of earth. "Do you hear that?" Heather whispered. They all did. The creek was inside with them now, breathing in rhythm with their own breaths. Inhale, exhale, flow, pause, flow, pause. Michael pressed his palm flat against the tent floor. The ground was damp but not wet, cool but not cold. Beneath it, he felt a shift in expansion, a contraction like the pulse of lungs hidden under stone. They lay awake for a long time, listening. Each time one of them adjusted a shoulder or turned in a sleeping bag, the creek adjusted too, flowing louder then softer, as though mimicking them. When sleep came, it was not ordinary sleep. It was shallow, tidal, full of water. Each of them dreamed they were not bodies at all, but streams. James dreamed of sliding over rocks, polished smooth as skin. Laura dreamed of twisting around roots, curling in the dark places where light never touched. Heather dreamed she was rain returning to the bed of the stream, joining others without effort. Michael dreamed he was the stone beneath it all, silent, unmoving, letting water carve him grain by grain. They woke at different hours, but each time they did, the creek was still whispering inside the tent, as though reminding them they had not left its path, no matter where they thought they had wandered. By the time dawn came, the sound had changed. The water no longer murmured its side. It was tired, almost lost, as though even the creek did not know where it was going anymore. Laura sat up and listened, her hair falling damp against her face. The fire outside had died to ash. She closed her eyes and breathed with the creek, slow and steady, until its sigh grew calmer, until the voice of water softened back into something like peace. When they stepped out into the clearing, the forest felt rearranged. The alder with the scar was gone. The quartz-veined rock was nowhere to be seen. The loop had opened, or perhaps it had never been real at all. The creek flowed forward now, confidently, as if it had remembered its way. They followed it, walking lighter, as though they too had been unknotted. Later, when the forest thinned and the ridge rose higher, they found a mark carved into a fallen log near the bank. A single word, written long ago but still legible. Return. Michael traced the letters with his thumb. He felt not warning but reassurance, as if the creek had been teaching them a lesson. Everything returns. Water to river, rain to soil, dream to waking, wanderer to path. They walked on. The creek guided them once more, its voice steady, sure, kind. That night, farther down, the water's song was ordinary again, a stream against stone, a voice that had remembered itself. And in their sleep, each of them dreamed the same simple dream. They were water, and the rain was showing them the way home. The rain had started before noon and never really stopped. It didn't pound or lash. It arranged itself patient, even finding every needle of spruce, every bared stone, every seam of canvas. By late afternoon, the ridge settled into a quieter version of itself. Clouds hung low, and the forest wore that rinsed, considerate mood it gets when everything has agreed to speak softly. They found the campsite as if it had been thinking of them. It waited under a tall spruce whose lowest branches swept the ground like a skirt. There was a ring of stones, all face in ash pale in the center, as if yesterday's fire had been put to bed and told a good story. A neat bundle of kindling rested beneath a square of bark where rain couldn't touch. An old metal pot lay upside down on a smooth flake of shale, its handle folded like a hand at rest. No footprints in the soft duff, no scuffs, no wrappers, no rope burns on the bark. Not abandoned paused. They stopped the way you do at a threshold, at the moment between public and private. Michael lifted a palm, an unconscious gesture, like saying hello before you speak. Laura leaned and peered under the bark. Cedar shavings were curled tight and dry, blonde as wheat. Heather traced the rim of one of the stones and felt the faint warmth a rock holds even on wet days. James adjusted his pack, and his buckle made a small, polite clink that answered the drizzle. Someone keeps this, Heather said, voice low, as if a sleeping person were in the next room. Or the place keeps itself, Laura answered, not smiling, only putting the thought on the table where they could all see it. They could have claimed it. The ground was level, the drainage was clean, the spruce would catch a good share of rain, but the arrangement had a self. It looked like a room every house knows, the room you tidy before guests arrive, the one waiting with lamps off because dusk is enough. They stepped back together, the way people step back from a painting without agreeing to. They chose a hollow 30 paces away, close enough to share weather, far enough to let the silent sight keep its shape. Their own camp took form with that unhurried choreography evenings know. Tarp first, slanted low so wind could not climb under it. Tent next, corners squared by habit. Guy lines found the right hum. Stove and pot in the leeward corner. Rain stitched the whole scene shut. When the small flame came, it came with a hush, a blue whisper that swelled to amber, and then settled into the patient voice of cedar. They kept their talk small. The forest was already speaking. Steam from dinner curled up and bent again, and disappeared into the spruce's dark skirt. The creek below made quiet comparisons between stones. Somewhere far off, a branch laid itself down instead of falling. When the wind moved, the spruce answered with a deep, friendly shiver that you felt more in the ribs than in the ear. After they ate, the light thinned into that hour with no edges. They noticed things in layers. First, a faint sweetness on the air, not their own fires, smoke holder, softer, almost the honeyed breath of seasoned wood, barely thinking of flame. Then, a sound light as a spoon touching a rim, metal on stone, once, then not again. Then, the feeling rooms have when someone is in them who means you no harm. The hair did not rise. The shoulders did not tense. Instead, a part of the body that keeps doorways warmed itself. They looked toward the silent site. Nothing moved. The pot was still upside down. The bark still covered the bundle. But a grace had come over the place, the way a porch looks lived in when a lamp is on just beyond the window, even if you can't see it. Michael reached into his pocket and found a coin. He balanced its weight for a moment and set it back where it came from. The idea of paying a host felt wrong in a house that refused to name itself a house. Laura slipped a single cedar, shaving from her own bag under the bark at the silent site, no more than a breath added to a breath. For whoever waits, she said, and that was all. They pitched their tent, and the zipper made its soft teeth song. Sleeping bags opened. Damp socks found a place near, but not too near, to the embering stove. They kept their headlamps low, round moons set to the dimmest phase. Rain established its long pulse on the fly and kept it. The night folded itself the way careful hands fold a quilt. Inside, they lay still and listened. Silence in the forest is never empty. It is occupied by patient, small citizens. The tent fabric answered the rain like skin. The ground beneath held the day's heat like a mild promise. Their breath slowed to the rate where thinking becomes less important than rhythm. Then came the faintest sound from the silent site. A match, note too sharp. A thumb passing the teeth of a striker, then not catching, then not used at all. A single tiny click of metal lightly set down. The kind of sound a careful person makes when they don't want to wake a house. No one unzipped the tent. There's a way to ruin a kindness by rushing to see it. They let the sound be itself. In the glow behind their eyelids, each saw something different and the same. A pair of hands they'd never met. Older than their own, steady, content to make order in a place because order is a gift. Time in the middle of the night lengthened like rain trails on glass. They slept, but not completely. They woke, but not entirely. The silent sight made a handful of domestic syllables. The rustle of bark lifted, and set back, the mild tick a cooling rock gives, a breath drawn deeper near damp cedar. Between these, the spruce did its deep, slow breathing. Between even that, the rain counted in measures too even to keep. Heather dreamed a kitchen that had no walls and no roof. Shelves made of moss held nothing but were full. She brewed tea by placing a cup on a stump. The cup filled itself with steam, and the steam became warmth, and the warmth became sleep. James dreamed he swept a floor that was the forest floor. The sweep made no visible change, yet everything felt ready afterward, as if shoes would not squeak and steps would be welcome. Laura dreamed she set plates on a table long as a ridgeline, and each plate was the moon at a different hour. Michael dreamed he read a recipe that was only actions with no ingredients. Gather, wait, listen, warm, return. Sometime near the blue edge of morning, as if a long note were changing key, a clearer sound arrived. The little rush when hot water meets cold air. Not a boil, not a rolling. The beginning of steam. It carried gingerly through the rain and under the spruce. If a fire burned, It burned smaller house lamp, not a torch. If a light shone, it shone inward. They slept again. Sleep the second time is heavier when the world is kind. When they woke, the rain had thinned to silver hair. They stepped out into air that remembered all the seasons at once. The silent sight looked the same and not the same. The pot was no longer upside down. It sat upright on the shale, lid set at a tilt to let breath escape. A thin ribbon of steam lifted and unmade itself as soon as it began. No footprints. No drips repeated where knees would have pressed. The ash inside the ring held a new pattern of grey, not warm anymore, just organized in a way none of them would have arranged it. A single twig lay across two stones as if indicating where flame would catch if flame were wanted. Laura walked over with hands at her sides, palms open to show the morning nothing in her fingers. She touched the pot's handle with one knuckle. "Room temperature," she said, and smiled at the paradox of steam that does not measure on skin. Heather slipped 2 dry cedar curls from her pocket, placed them under the bark with the others, and tucked the square back so rain could continue to be excluded with dignity. James straightened one stone that had slouched. The way you straighten a frame on a wall, though it would have hung fine without it. Michael poured half a cup of their water into the pot clear, plain, and set the lid back at the same tilt. "In case whoever returns prefers the ritual," he said. "No note, no mark, only acts that could be read by anyone who already understood." They ate their own breakfast in the gentle vicinity of the other room. Their stove made a modest hiss, like a moth caught and released. The tea was the kind that tastes like nothing until you have slept outdoors, when it tastes like being allowed. The path asked for them again around mid-morning. They packed the way you pack when you have stayed in a borrowed place, slow enough to notice where each thing had been so you can return the shape of the space. All 4 stood a moment inside the circumference of the silent site and said nothing that would pin it down. Then they lifted their packs and left it as it had found them. On the trail, the rain made a finer grain, more mist than drops, and spiderwebs appeared that had been invisible all night, jeweled and exact. The ridge rose. A flicker of sun thought about arriving and changed its mind. The creek to the west resumed its low conversation with stones. After half an hour, a breeze from behind reached them with a scent that made them all turn their heads a little. Wood smoke, as light as memory, carrying a sweetness you could mistake for a season. Not their smoke, not their breath. A little warmth rising through damp boughs, a reminder that the room behind them had not stayed empty. No one said, "Do you smell that?" No one laughed or named it. It's rude to shout down the hall when a neighbor has just lit their lamp. They walked on and let the smell be part of the day. When it faded, it left behind a space in the air that was not a lack but a neatness, like a book replaced where your hand expects it. The forest widened, then narrowed. They crossed a small gullies, not laced with roots and stepped stones. They saw an old blaze swallowed at the edges by bark. They encountered a fallen trunk where someone had cut a notch a long time ago. A careful stare down and back up. The rain kept them company without insisting on conversation. Each hour sounded a little different, more leaf in one, more moss in the next, then a section where the ground itself seemed to hum. At lunch they ate on the lee side of a boulder with a thin veil of water coming off its face. The veil made a constant silk sound and kept insects polite. They shared an apple and placed the cores in a bag. Michael almost said something about the silent sight and then chose not to. Laura didn't say it either. It was enough that they were all thinking of the same room and keeping it intact by not shaping it with talk. That evening, the trail delivered them to another reasonable place to sleep. Not as poised as the spruce room, but honest two maples making a door frame, a level patch of ground, a faint old ring half lost to ferns. They made their own circle small. They kept their light low. Habit, now, rather than rule. The rain opened and closed its hand through the hours, and they matched its pace without counting. In the night, somewhere between one kind of dark and the next, a sound travelled a little too evenly to be an accident. The measured clink of a lid being set down, metal on stone, once, then again, then still, not near, not far. It arrived as if on a narrow path, just wide enough for a listener. The four of them breathed, the way a house breathes in cold weather, together, slow. Heather mouthed, "Thank you," toward no particular direction. James reached out and found the back of Michael's hand for a moment. Not to share fear, only to register that there are parts of the world you can hold with anything but company. Laura tucked her chin closer to her collar and pictured the room under the spruce as clearly as she could. The ring, the bark, the pot, the patient readiness of it. In her mind, she set a second cup beside the first. She did not need to know who would use it. The picture was the whole action. Morning comes differently after nights like that. You wake not because an alarm goes off, but because the forest has finished a chapter. Light gathers under the skin of everything. You feel it before you see it. They stepped out into air that had decided to be new. The leaves shone by their own rules. Far off, a puff of smoke unmade itself in rain that had forgotten to fall for a minute. They packed and went on. On a ridge, half a mile later, a small sign leaned from a post. Letters paled to the color of bone. It did not name a campsite. It did not warn or welcome. It said, in a hand that looked like many hands had traced it, "Leave ready." Underneath, smaller, nearly eaten by weather, "Fire small, water half, bark tight, move softly." They stood in a loose line and let the words be the words. "I like the order," James said, and because he'd said it aloud, they all liked it more. Fire, water, shelter, passage. "Move softly," Heather repeated, like the second beat of a heartbeat. No one took a picture. They carried the sign the way they carried rain, not as proof, but as weather. The rest of the day felt made of that sequence. When they stopped to adjust a strap, they made it with careful hands. When they stepped around a sapling, they let the sapling finish its thought first. When they crossed the creek, they placed each foot so stones could keep their shape for whoever used them next. Nights multiplied and gentled after that, as nights will when you behave. Some held thin bells of water hitting some hidden rim. Some held the far hush of an animal careful not to disturb. Once, wind leaned on the tent wall, and the wall leaned back like an old friend leaning shoulder to shoulder on a porch. Each time they found signs of care-dry cedar tucked, ashes made tidy. A pot set ready, they answered with the same measures. A few shavings, a half cup, the lid at a tilt, the bark set back tight, the leaving done softly. And each time later, whether in that place or beyond it, the world repaid them with some small domestic kindness. A wind that waited for the zipper before it gusted. A branch that decided to fall somewhere else. A warmth that found them under the tarp when the rain considered being cold. On the last morning, before the trail returned them to their other lives, they paused without arranging two in a stand of young pines, slim trunks pale as wrists. The rain, having done enough, rested in the air as mist and let them hear themselves. Michael said, "I keep thinking of the room, even when I'm not in it." Laura nodded. "Me too. It makes everywhere feel like a house I should leave ready." Heather exhaled through her nose, a quiet laugh. "I think the forest is that house," she said, and the notion did not feel like metaphor so much as inventory. James lifted his eyes to the canopy and watched a single drop let go, fall, and vanish into the padded earth. "Move softly," he said, and they did, all the way down the last turn, where the path widened and the day opened and a different kind of sound, distant, bright, began to filter in. Behind them, under the spruce whose skirt kept her world dry, a pot sat with its lid at a thoughtful angle. The ring of stones waited as rings wait. A square of bark-covered curls of cedar like a blanket. No one owned any of it. Every passerby owned the order. And if, now and then, someone lifted the lid at dawn and saw steam rise once and then be gotten well, that was only the room breathing, the way rooms breathe when they have been treated kindly. The rain, hearing this, arranged its stitches a little tighter at the hem of the forest and went on sewing. The fifth night began with rain, as they all seemed to be. Not fierce rain, not hurried rain, but the kind that feels patient, as if it has been falling for centuries and will go on falling long after you are gone. It whispered over spruce needles, tapped on canvas, collected in shallow moss bowls, and overflowed without notice. Every sound was softened by it. Even their footsteps as they stepped off the ridge and into a hollow felt erased as soon as they were made. They followed the creek again, but here it widened into a boggy plain, the water thin and uncertain, searching for a path among grasses and reeds. The trail thinned too, its blazes faint, its boards slick with age. The air was thick with mist, curling low, lifting only to reveal the ghost of trunks in every direction. When the mist deepened into something near a fog, they heard it. A bell, not loud, not shrill, not the kind that orders or warns. A single, rounded chime carried across the damp air. It arrived as if from a distance greater than the forest allowed, clear but softened, definite but gentle, the kind of sound that is felt in the chest before the ear admits it. They paused. The rain continued. The creek slid onward, but the bell measured the space between heartbeats, chime, then silence, a silence so full of rain that it hardly seemed like silence at all. Then another chime, exactly the same distance apart. Heather drew her hood tighter and whispered, "Is there a church out here?" Michael shook his head. Not for miles. Nothing but trees. They listened again. The bell did not hurry, did not falter. It came every 8 breaths or so, steady as the rain, patient as the forest. The sound stayed with them as they set their camp. Their fire burned low, unwilling to reach higher in the damp air. Their food tasted of smoke more than spice. The tent fabric carried the bell as clearly as the rain carried water. Each time it came, their bodies stilled for a moment, as though adjusting themselves to its rhythm. The chime seemed less like an external sound and more like a pulse in the air itself, a sound that was present whether heard or not. That night, lying in their bags, Laura timed her breathing to it. Inhale for 4 drops of rain, exhale for the pause, then the bell, then again. Soon her whole body had forgotten itself and moved only in the measure of that sound. Sleep met her halfway. James heard it differently. For him, the bell was not in the distance, but within the tent. He felt it in the floor, in the soil, in the soles of his feet. Each chime loosened the knots of thought he had carried all day. He imagined it as a signal not to move, not to find, not to chastenly to be still long enough for the rain to finish its work. Heather dreamed she was following the bell across water. Not a river, not a lake, just water that stretched with no shore. Each chime revealed a ripple moving toward her, a ripple that never broke, never ended. When she woke, the sound was still there, falling exactly into the space between her waking breath and her sleeping one. Michael dreamed differently. He dreamed he was the bell. A small disc of metal hung from a tree, damp with moss, patient under weather. Wind touched him sometimes, and he spoke a sound so clean it surprised even himself. Each chime was a greeting, never a warning, never a command. He woke with the rain heavy on the canvas and realized he had been smiling in his sleep. By dawn, the bell faded with the fog. The forest brightened. Rain thinned. The sound did not return. They broke camp slowly, as if reluctant to step out of the measure that had carried them through the night. The creek led them onward, and just when the sun began to think of piercing through, they found it. A tree older than the others, its bark swollen and scarred, its trunk widened by centuries. A thin steel tag, the size of a hand, hung from a nail driven in long ago. The tag had weathered to dull silver, edges curled, face pitted. When the breeze shifted, it tapped against the trunk. Not loudly, not irregularly, just enough to chime, soft as a spoon against porcelain. Laura reached up and stilled it with her hand. The silence that followed felt incomplete, like a sentence cut short. She let go, and the bell returned to its rhythm, as if grateful to be left to its work. James looked around. Other markers were scattered in the forest, half swallowed by bark, some fallen to the moss. One lay flat on the ground, dulled almost to nothing, a coin in a green sea. He picked it up, set it back on its nail. The tree did not seem to mind. The sound resumed, faint but sure, part of the forest's vocabulary. They walked on, and as distance grew, the chime softened until it could no longer be heard. But in their breathing, it remained. Each of them carried it differently. Laura in her lungs, James in his feet, Heather in her dreams, Michael in the memory of being the sound itself. That night, far from the bog, with rain thinner and stars briefly showing, the bell returned once more. Not in the air, not in the trees, within them, a single chime falling into silence, reminding them not the time of day, but the time between thoughts. And they slept, steady as the rain. Rain made a quiet room out of the world. They'd pitched the tent just off the ridge where the ground rose like a shoulder, and the vestibule became a small porch with a roof of nylon and a floor of needles. The stove murmured beneath the open flap. Steam from the pot drifted outward and braided with mist. They kept headlamps low. The forest accepted the arrangement. After dinner, James unfolded the topo map in the vestibular broad, well-creased sheet in a cloudy plastic sleeve. Lines rippled over it like sleeping water. Someone long ago had traced an old trail with a faint pencil, so light that it showed only when the paper bent a certain way. Near the margin, almost erased, a small circle carried a fragile label. Spring seasonal. It might be dry by now, Heather said. Not disappointed, only realistic. We have enough for tomorrow, Michael answered, but it would be good to top off. Laura warmed her hands around a cup, listening to the rain touch the map cover with a sound like careful tapping on glass. Condensation gathered on the inside of the sleeve, first as patient beads in the corners. Then almost Scheither beads began to slide. A thread pulled itself between two drops, then another, then three, until a thin, silver line drew across the map, all on its own. It followed the faint pencil ghost exactly, a bright wet filament echoing the nearly forgotten trail. They stilled, no one laughed. The tent fabric breathed with the wind. The stove ticked as it cooled. The lines of water kept forming, slow, deliberate. Unhurried marking a narrow path down a spur, across a contour, through a cluster of tight lines where the ridge folded. When the thread reached the tiny circle, it gathered, pooled, and sat there lucid and round. a clear eye over spring seasonal. After a moment, one bright drop let go and traveled farther, tracing a careful loop that ended at the corner of the sheet, where the scale and compass rose lived. It rested there like a small conclusion. "Did you see that?" James whispered, though of course they all had. Laura said softly, "The map remembers," and placed 2 fingers on the plastic. Not to change anything, only to feel the cool. They did not decide to follow it that night. They set the map aside, as if setting a book face down to keep a place. They zipped the vestibule. The rain braided longer music on the fly. Sleep, when it came, carried a draft of lines with it. Intervals, contours, the slow logic of water. Each dream was a kind of drawing. Heather dreamed she was the pencil, wandering lightly and guided by grain. Michael dreamed he was the paper, receiving marks without pain, without resistance. James dreamed he was the drop, gathering, choosing a direction because gravity was gentle instruction. Laura dreamed she was the forgotten path, and waking feet felt like a story being retold with respect. They woke in the hour that has no edges. The stove metal cooled to its last small ping. Somewhere, a moth tapped once against the fly and then found rest. The rain thinned to the size of breath. When dawn finally took the room apart, the map lay on the vest floor, ordinary again. The condensation dried to faint halos that vanished if you looked straight at them and reappeared if you looked from the corner of your eye. They ate quietly and packed what weight the morning allowed. The map went in the front pocket of Michael's jacket, not for constant consultation, but because the breast pocket felt like the right kind of keeping. The forest waited at a patient distance and then stepped close. They kept their lights off. The day was grey and generous. The woods showed them enough. The faint wet-drawn line from last night had the effect of confidence on their bodies. It did not make them fast. It made them deliberate. They found the beginning of a spur trail where ferns leaned away from one another as if they had a small, kind disagreement. They moved between them and the trail formed under feet that did not insist. At the first fold of the ridge, a cluster of young birches leaned like a set of parentheses. Inside that curve, fallen leaves felt thin and papery under the damp older seasons lying down to make a note. A second fold brought them to a seam of rock where water had once run hard and now only whispered. The map in Michael's pocket warmed with his breath. The paper softened slightly, like bread. They walked in the rhythm rain teaches. No skipping, no dragging, just the pace that makes thinking friendly. When the faint path hesitated at a tangle of blowdown, they stopped without speaking and waited. The rain filled the space they had been making with footfalls. A bird tested a single note, found it acceptable, and made no more. In that pause, the way forward showed itself by not snagging one gap in the branches wider than the rest. The way a sentence sometimes makes room for a thought to pass through it. Beyond the tangle, the ground sloped into a shallow saddle. Here, the air changed temperature by so little a compass could not have told it, but skin could. The earth smelled green in a way stone never does. Laura knelt and pressed a palm to the soil. Cool, not cold. Damp, not wet. Listening, the spring revealed itself with humility, out of a low seam between roots. Water arrived without drama and immediately decided to leave, slipping into grass in a path the width of 2 fingers. No pool, no mirror, only a persistent beading along the lip of earth, forming, letting go, forming again. Seasonal, Heather said, and the words sounded generous rather than stingy. They did not hurry to fill. They watched. The spring did its small work without performance. When they set a bottle beneath the lip, water tapped the plastic like a shy guest at a door. They took turns, tipping gently so the sediment would not cloud. The taste on the tongue, when it came, was remarkable, not for any sweetness or mineral boast, but for restraint. Clean, cool, quiet water that had not learned anyone's story yet, and did not need to. James looked up from where he crouched and noticed 3 stones set in a rough triangle beneath a fringe of moss. Not stacked, not ritual, only suggested. He added a 4th nearby, a low agreement rather than a monument. Laura brushed pine needles away from the spring-s mouth and tucked them back farther up the bank, so the next rain would not carry them into the seam. They didn't speak of ownership or discovery. They stood as if at a bedside where someone slept and you were simply there to be there. The rain thickened to a proper shower and then, in the next breath, gentled again, the way a caretaker adjusts a blanket without waking the body beneath. When their bottles were full, the spring kept offering, untroubled that the need had been met. They capped their water. Michael pressed the map flat on his thigh and found a small circle again with his thumb. The paper held the faint halo the condensation had left, the memory of its own instruction. He did not trace it, he let it exist. The way back did not entirely coincide with the way in. This often happens when you allow the woods to have their say. A fallen snag they didn't recall built a new sentence across their hips. A slight sidestep opened a view through 2 trunks onto a pale meadow they hadn't seen. The path did not contradict itself. It revised. When they looked down, their boot prints from the approach were still visible in places, softened already by rain into suggestions. In other places there was nothing, and that made sense too. Midway up the spur, a moth joined them, pale as a scrap of old map. It rode the inside cuff of Heather's sleeve for several minutes, facing forward like a passenger. When it left like thought leaves, when a better one arrives without resistance, without loss. At the blowdown, they waited again. The pause gave back the thin bird note. It felt like being told, in a language with few words, that passing through is a kind of promise. To enter softly, to leave ready. They stepped through, a little lighter. Back at camp, the tent had become its daytime self again. A red door in a green neighborhood. The vestibule smelled faintly of tea. The map went on the ground sheet and lay open, unassuming. No silver lines moved now. The label spring seasonal looked less like a warning and more like a kindness away for one set of hands to tell another. If the world is willing, there is water here. Michael turned the map over. On the back, the manufacturer's grid carried stains and pencil ghosts from other trips' coffee at the corner. A smudge that might have been river mud. A phone number effaced. Laura took a soft pencil from her kit and added nothing. She held the point above the circle, then rested it back in the tin. "We don't need to," she said. "It already knows." That afternoon they moved through a forest that had grown clearer by not brightening. Faces of trees came forward. The ground's grammar made itself gentle roots where feet should lift, stone where feet should test, duff where feet should settle. The rain retired from full sentences to a few approving syllables. Their talk reflected it. A note about a fern, a half laugh, silence that was not empty but furnished. Toward evening they stopped at a knoll of hemlock and found a small, level bed between 2 old stumps. They made camp with the kindness, tired hands, no lines neither too tight nor too slack. A fire small enough to be believed by wet wood. The water from the spring poured into the pot with a clear voice. When it boiled, steam lifted and wrote a brief, invisible paragraph at the edge of the tarp. They drank slowly. The tea tasted like what it was placed in. Tin, rain, heat, the hour. No one asked the map to show another trick. No one needed it to. Night rearranged the room. The tent walls became the color of thinking. Beyond them, the forest did the dark work forests do: repair, digest, keep. In the vestibule, folded on the ground sheet, the map softened in the mild humidity and then, as the night cooled, stiffened back to its usual self. Sometime after midnight, when the rain was thin and the mind was thinner, James thought he heard a quiet sound like pencil on paper, 2 or 3 small strokes, smiled without waking. They slept in a way that might have been called grateful, if anyone had been awake to name it. Each of them dreamed without pictures, againly measures, a long, even count that wrapped around breath and back. The measure had the feel of contours, closer lines where care was needed, wide lines where ease was possible. When they turned in their bags, the measure turned with them. Before dawn, Laura woke and lay still. The forest was a held breath. She reached for the map in the vestibule and, without opening the sleeve, placed her palm over the circle where the spring lived. The paper felt like paper. Nothing moved. She did not need it to. "Thank you," she said, so quietly even she barely heard it. Morning arrived as an act of mercy. They ate, they packed. They stepped out into a world that had been wiped clean overnight, but was still recognizably itself. The first 100 yards of the Day-S trail were a kind of interleaving between what they remembered and what was truly there. Then the two were the same, as happens once you give up making them match. A mile later, on a slight rise, a weathered stake leaned at an angle that made it look thoughtful. A tin disc, no bigger than a palm, hung from a nail and turned occasionally, making that delicate tink metal makes when it enjoys being metal. Stamped into its face, almost unreadable, a word had been hammered long ago. Survey. Someone had added a smaller mark beneath with a hand punch. A tiny circle and a line. Not an O and not a one more, like a spring and a path. They didn't touch it. They understood. Maps are agreements, after all, not commands, conversations between place and intention. Last night, the forest had done the talking. Tonight, they would listen again. By the time the ridge widened into a familiar shoulder, the rain had folded itself into the air so completely that nothing seemed wet. The tent would be dry when they set it. The kindling would be willing. The stove would sing. When Michael finally drew the map from his pocket to put it away for good, he saw, just for a blink, the faintest watermark circle where spring seasonal had been. He tried to show Heather, but as soon as he held it to the light, the circle was gone. "That's all right," she said. "We're carrying it." "Where?" James asked, smiling. Heather touched her chest. "Here," she said, and Laura nodded, and Michael folded the map along its first old creaster, one you can find by feel in the dark hand, slipped it back. They walked on at the pace the rain prefers, steady, considerate, a little slower than the clock would ask. And if the path shifted under them into clarity now and then, as if a line were being drawn, one careful drop at a time, they did not point it out. Naming it would not make it truer. That night when the stove's last tick faded and the tent settled its fabric, a very light sound came from the vestibule only, the weight of paper adjusting to coolant the world inside and outside, agreed again on the shape of things. The map slept folded. The spring kept giving miles away. The forest kept its pencil sharp. And the rain, good teacher, traced a thin, shining route from breath to breath, all the way until morning. The rain had been falling all afternoon, steady and unbroken, soaking through the canopy and turning the forest floor into a dark, glistening carpet. By the time we reached the river's edge, the world felt hushed. swallowed in that deep woodland silence that seems to exist only after hours of rain. Each step carried the soft suction of boots in mud, each breath curling in the cool, damp air, every sound muffled beneath the endless rainfall. We had chosen this campsite because of the river. Its banks spread wide and flat here, a clearing framed by towering pines whose dark silhouettes leaned forward as if to listen. The current moved lazily, heavy with the runoff from the hills, carrying with it broken branches and leaves that swirled past in the dim grey light. The place had a quiet beauty, but also a strange weight, like an echo of something long forgotten. When night came, it came without stars. Clouds pressed low, sealing away the sky, leaving only the sound of rain on the taut nylon of our tents. Inside, the air was warm, faintly humid, filled with the mingling sense of damp clothes and river moss. My companions drifted off one by one, lulled by exhaustion, their breathing steady and slow, but I stayed awake, listening. The rain had its rhythm and endless percussion, soft yet insistent, and beneath it I began to hear something else. A faint splash, another, then silence. I told myself it was the current tossing branches, but after the third time I unzipped the tent and leaned out into the darkness. The river gleamed faintly in the distance, a broken mirror reflecting the thin light of the campfire's last embers, and on the far bank I saw it, a glow, small, flickering, a lantern, its flame wavering as if it was swaying in the rain. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The light remained, and then another appeared. A second lantern, hanging some distance away, glowing faintly gold in the mist. I waited, breath caught, watching as a third winked into being, further still, a line forming along the riverbank. I whispered to myself that perhaps it was another group of campers, but the lanterns didn't move. They just glowed, quiet and steady, burning in defiance of the storm. I returned inside, pulled the zipper shut, and told myself to rest. Yet every few minutes, I peeked out again. The lanterns were always there, watching from across the water, their light steady, patient. Some time past midnight, the fire was gone, the rain still falling, and sleep hovered just beyond reach. My eyelids sagged, heavy, when another sound cut through the faint splash of water. I sat up, heart slow but uneasy. Again a splash. Closer this time, deliberate. Something moving through the river. I told myself it was a deer crossing in the dark. But when I leaned out once more, the lanterns were gone. The opposite bank was empty, swallowed in blackness. The sound of water continued, a slow, dragging sound, then silence. I lay down, forcing my eyes closed, willing myself to drift into the rhythm of rain. The storm grew louder, wrapping the tent in white noise, and for a time I thought I had imagined it all. But just before sleep took me, I opened my eyes one last time. Through the thin fabric of the tent, faint and golden, I saw a glow. Not outside by the river, but close, too close. The outline of a lantern's flickering light moved past, its glow stretching long shadows across the canvas. I held my breath. The rain masked every sound but the faint hiss of flame. The glow lingered, hovering, as if whoever held it was listening. Then, slowly, it drifted away. When dawn came, the river was swollen, restless, carrying debris downstream. There were no footprints along the bank, no lanterns hanging from branches. My companions awoke, refreshed, unaware. I said nothing, only watched the river flow, the rain still falling. And in that soft grey morning, just as I began to believe it had been nothing more than a dream, the current carried something past our camp. A glass lantern, its flame still faintly burning despite the rain. The rain continues, soft, steady, endless. Each story we have wandered through tonight lingers like mist between the trees' shadows moving at the edge of firelight. Whispers carried by the river, footsteps pressing into the mud of forgotten trails. Perhaps they were only tales, perhaps they were only dreams. But dreams, like forests, have paths that twist and double back. And when the night grows long, and the rain does not let up, the line between dream and memory grows thin. As you rest now, let the rhythm of the storm carry you. Let the images of dark woods, of distant lanterns, of voices lost to the wilderness, dissolve into something quieter. With each breath, with each drop against the canvas of the tent, the unease fades, leaving only the sound of rain. Out here, the world is vast, untamed, older than memory. You are small within it, but safe sheltered, wrapped in calm, drifting deeper with every heartbeat. The stories are behind you now, fading like campfire smoke. Ahead lies only stillness. Close your eyes. Listen to the storm. The rain never stops, and neither does the night. Sleep and let the forest keep its secrets.